So I thought we might talk about the drinking culture a bit. Appreciate things moved on a lot after your time and during your time in the Navy. You had the rum ration. Did you, at the very start of your time, you had the rum ration for the first 20 years or so?
Yes, well, the rum ration was, I think, stopped in the mid 70s. Prior to that, it surprised me slightly how any senior rate could ever actually do any work in the afternoons, because the majority of them would have the rum ration, 1/8 of a pint of very, very strong rum, probably in the senior rates mess, washed down by a pint of beer.
Yep.
Which was way, way, way over any driving limit.
There must have been things that have changed for the better. And also maybe we've lost something along the way as well. Because when we were a lot younger, having a supportive spouse was almost like having an unpaid extra member of the armed forces that didn't do the operational stuff.
Absolutely.
But did all the welfare and the looking after of the other families.
Yes.
But without any financial gain or reward.
Yeah.
And that has completely changed.
Yeah, that was exactly what was expected of us. And for me, that wasn't a problem hugely, because I didn't have a career of my own. I worked, but I didn't have a career as such. I see other people where both people in the partnership have careers, and it does cause conflict. So I think really we were extremely lucky.
Eric was totally offbeat, and I just couldn't get my head around him to start off with, but certainly a lot of people couldn't get their head around this guy for quite a while. He was so left field, thinking about everything else outside the box. Whenever we had our meetings, we'd always wait for Eric to say something which was totally at odds with everything else, but meant so much common sense because he was so intellectually better than most of us. But Eric came into his own later on when he was leaving the service, so the last 6 months of his time. They said, right, you're going to be the quartermaster, and you're going to do all the piping around the establishment and all this type of stuff, the main broadcast piping. And every morning they gave him latitude, basically, to say something like, instead of the normal routine, wakey, wakey, rise and shine, you've had your sleep, I want mine, he would then extend it with a massive, great poetry version.
Throughout my time in the service, women just didn't happen. They didn't go to sea, and certainly when I joined the Navy in the 50s, the thought of women actually being at sea wasn't even thought about. And consequently, it was a very male atmosphere, and certainly people, when not at sea, I never drank at sea ever, but certainly in the evenings, one tended to behave rather badly. And I think probably the introduction of women is going to tame that down, which will be a very good thing. Would you say the same, in fact, within the RAF, that the introduction of women has actually stopped perhaps men behaving badly?
And that's the first time and last time I probably ever remember something like that being totally off-piste, that everybody, both rank and rating, just understood where this guy was coming from, but he was just so unusual. Yeah. And I don't think we could have tolerated that after the time. From
being just an AB Wren, not allowed into the wardroom unless it was to wait on tables at a function, and then I had to go through the back door. All of a sudden there I was as an officer's wife, and being called ma'am and allowed in the front door and everything, and treated nicely. This is rather nice, but I was always very aware of where I'd come from, and where some of the officers and some of the wives treated the staff with some disdain. I never ever did that.
People mistrusted me in the mess because submarine's an all-male environment where drinking a pint is sort of that sort of thing, manly thing you do, and I didn't participate in any of that. And until people got to know me a bit better, very much people looked askance and mistrusted me, and there's quite a lot of pressure to drink.
I think, unfortunately, that's true, and I think inevitably people didn't join in with everyone else, were considered to be out of the fold.
Do you think there's greater pressure for men to sort of conform in that way, and socially as well as sort of in the work environment, understand conformity, because you're in the armed forces and you work as a team, and you've got to have certain rules that you've got to follow as a group? But it always struck me as odd that the same pressure to conform existed outside of work, that in your social life there was.
I think there was a lot of pressure.
But one particular guy stood out who was known as the Prof by everybody because he looked rather professorial and had a sort of rather hoity air to him. But he was liked a lot. But his particular feature is that he was a great fan of German opera. And he probably spent his 2 weeks leave in the summer going to Bayreuth and listening to the whole of the Ring cycle or something like that. And this was just so out of kilter with his peer group, bombardiers being equivalent corporals, who, some of them went on to do great things, but he at that particular level was so different. Although he was seen as slightly strange, he's our bloke, and he's our strange bloke. And so people used to be very protective of him and things like that.
There was a breed of army wives that used to like the fact that they were mentioned in their husband's annual report as being a supportive wife and, part of the team.
Excellent.
Was that something that ever happened to you?
No, it was mentioned once or twice. I did get a mention occasionally, but I can't remember making a big deal of it at all.
I was on HMS Argyle when it was all men on board, and then I came back a year later to the same ship, mostly the same people, but a few female officers had joined, and I noticed a very sort of quite a sinister atmosphere amongst the men who suddenly felt quite threatened, I think, and felt that they had something to prove, and there was quite a lot of jostling for status, that there was more drinking, perversely. I imagine after a couple of years it calmed down. But to start with, there was a sense of sort of them asserting their masculinity.
I can drink more than you, and
Yes.
therefore these girls who are coming in, as you call them, the pretty women, whatever it is.
Yes, that's right, pretty young soldiers.
Pretty young soldiers.
Yes, yeah.
Considered
It gave
a status to be able to hold your drink and drink more than anyone else.
Also, the Navy had this no touching rule. Do you remember that? The no touching rule, which I could never figure out. I thought that's really odd.
And it was strangely worded around like how it might affect, always around operational effectiveness.
And it was and it was a disciplinary case.
So when we brought the girls in, my commanding officer at the time insisted that the girls will do the twice a week PT that the boys did. And we were in Northern Ireland, so rocked up at 6:15 in the morning for commanding officers' beneficial boosting sessions. And to start with, he just said, no, they're part of the British Army. They will do exactly what we're doing. So, they would go off tabbing and he would be running alongside them, yelling at them and saying, come on, you fat slugs, keep up. Slugs, I stress, not anything else. And it became apparent very, very early on that this was not going to work and it would never work. He hadn't addressed initially, how can I change things in order to make things work the best for everybody?
There was a small sort of lockable cage on board for women's underwear. I remember at the time thinking, well, at least they've thought of that. There's somewhere for us to hang them, so they're, implying that they weren't, going to be swiped by any men. But now, of course, I look back at it and think, well, why on earth did we need to lock away our underwear?
Night duty in air operations. It had been the tradition when there were only male officers and other ranks to sometimes in the middle of the night shift before flying start, because it's a 24-hour base, they'd often put some porn on at sort of 2 a.m. when it was quiet and there wasn't anything to do. When I started on shift, when you ask about the change of behaviour, they all went next door and watched it, which it seemed quite courteous at the time, but no. It was now I don't believe that would happen at all. So that was the first step. 15 years later we've another step, and I don't think people in their 20s joining now would see that as at all acceptable.
There was no preparation provided to PTIs across the army for the wider employment of women. And I felt for these people because they hadn't been trained to accommodate a change in the way you do physical training and understanding the physical demands placed on different body frames and things like that.
I was the only woman, and this thing came about that we were in a bar up by the red light district.
Yes.
With the sort of windows, not windows like windows in the red light district, but there was a big bar with a big window, and you could see across the canal. And the guys came up with the idea of having a kitty to send the youngest junior officer over to go to a prostitute, which is actually, when I think about it, a really bizarre thing for me to be asked to contribute to.
We would embark all together, and we had our own sort of part of the ship that was the squadron's accommodation, which there was only like single washrooms. So they used to have a little thing on the door that you a little wooden slider for like, oh, it's men's, it's women's now, and then you could go in. But then but I think that was maybe for the toilets. I think the showers though were like cubicles, but that anybody could queue up and use them. I remember feeling that was a bit strict because they were only like curtains between them, and then you could hear your like male sort of superiors kind of all queued up in the morning. It felt slightly unnerving.
But how did you feel about that? Did you were you annoyed that you'd been asked to, as it were, contribute it to a certain extent? Ashamed of the behaviour of the men, that they behaved in that way in front of you? Or did you perhaps actually sort of join in that so-called fun of it?
To an extent, being more junior, I just assumed that was normal behaviour for a bunch of RAF aircrew abroad. If that had happened when I was in my mid-30s, I would have had a completely different reaction. But I did, when I did a tour at sea, again, the guys would all go to lap dancing bars. I'd be the only woman. I end up in the lap dancing bar. But I think it's just more as you get more of a voice. All of those things happened when I was the most junior rank.
I think it's quite interesting because in another angle, I think all three services are prone to getting stuff forced onto them by either something going wrong, some scandal happening, or societal pressures. They're not taking control themselves and getting on the sort of front foot. It was after lots and lots of pressure from women complaining about the combat body armour and the helmets in Afghanistan that somebody then applied their attention to it. Whereas a forward-leaning organisation would have seen that as part of the whole process of accommodating women into the armed forces.
If you left your camera at the bar when you kind of went to the loo or were buying a drink or something, you get back, and if they'd be a camera that you'd have to go and develop in those days, not digital or anything like that, and then you go to the chemist or send them away to TruePrint or whatever, and you get back and there'd be a whole load of men's genitals because they'd have swiped the camera, taken it away, and then taken lots of pictures. Just because they thought it was hilarious. And actually, do you know, instead of being really offended or trying to find out, the guy who'd done it to me one time had left his wristwatch on, so we managed to work out who it was, and then sort of posted it on the notice board with his sort of name and everything. But that was not. It wasn't because we were trying to get him into trouble. It was everybody thought it was funny, including us.
Yeah.
But it's not really seen as a thing in the military when you're serving to kind of have women's campaigns. I've never known a senior commander woman kind of try and rally us around to try and improve representation. Do you think that's something about the military culture, that campaigning is not, it's political with a small p? Perhaps it's just difficult to do in our cultures.
Part of the problem there is, I think, is the this thing called the chain of command, which we bestow so much sort of magic around, and if the chain of command is challenged in any way or sees an alternative voice, it gets very, very defensive.
But I totally remember someone who was bordering on hypothermia, really. He was not in a good way. We managed to get him a dry sleeping bag, and I shared a sleeping bag with him just to keep him warm. And again, that wasn't at all weird, but I remember telling my mum about it later, and again, not really understanding the context of it, her finding that really
So there were things that we did that we look back and think, no, that was a sensible thing to do, but still seem odd from the outside. And then there were things that we don't really remember until we start talking about it that were deeply odd.
Really strange.
The younger element in the mess, particularly the young females in the mess, who almost with envy, because they're just enjoying their career just as we did when we were younger. I'm conscious that they're perhaps looking at us as dinosaurs just because we're older wives, regardless of what our background is. And I do wonder if they think, or are they aware of what we went through in order for them to enjoy what they're enjoying now?
Yes.